Sarah loved the quiet hum of her apartment building. It was a low thrum of refrigerators, distant TVs, and the occasional muffled conversation that lulled her into a sense of calm. At 28, she had finally carved out a space that felt truly her own, a small two-bedroom in a brick building downtown. Sunlight streamed through the windows in the morning, warming the hardwood floors and illuminating the carefully chosen artwork on the walls. Evenings were for cooking elaborate meals, reading novels, or simply enjoying the city lights from her balcony. She worked as a graphic designer for a small firm, a job that allowed her to exercise her creativity and pay the bills comfortably. Weekends were spent exploring new restaurants, visiting museums, or catching up with friends. She had a routine, a comfortable rhythm to her life that she cherished. It wasn't perfect, but it was safe, predictable, and hers. This sense of security extended beyond the physical space of her apartment. It was also rooted in the unwavering support of the man she called Dad, even though he wasn't her biological father. David had stepped into her life when she was just a toddler, after her own father had left. He had married her mother, and from that moment on, he had treated Sarah as his own, without hesitation or reservation. He was the one who taught her to ride a bike, patiently running alongside her as she wobbled and fell, offering words of encouragement and dusting off her scraped knees. He helped her with her homework, even when the math problems seemed impossible. He sat through countless school plays, beaming with pride as she stumbled through her lines. He was always there, a constant presence in her life, a source of unconditional love and support. He was her dad, plain and simple. This was something she knew as fact. A feeling in her bones that told her this was true. He was Dad. Sometimes, when she looked at old photos, she would search for a resemblance, a shared feature that would solidify their bond in a tangible way. But there was nothing. She had her mother's dark hair and eyes, and her own father's sharp nose. David was fair, with kind blue eyes and a gentle smile that crinkled the corners of his face. In pictures of her biological father, there was a sneer in the smile and calculating glint in the eyes. David's eyes crinkled with a warmth that made her feel safe. The contrast was so great, and she was glad for that. Her memories of her biological father were hazy, fragmented images of a tall, shadowy figure who would occasionally visit, bringing with him a sense of unease and tension that even a small child could detect. He was more like a visitor, a distant relative that she was forced to be polite to. Those memories faded quickly after David came into her life. David had always been there, a constant, steady presence. He taught her how to drive, patiently guiding her through empty parking lots until she finally mastered the art of parallel parking. He helped her choose her college, encouraging her to pursue her passion for art, even when others questioned its practicality. He walked her down the aisle at her best friend's wedding, beaming with pride as if she were the one getting married. He was her rock, her confidant, her biggest fan. She would never forget those moments. He wasn't perfect, of course. They had their share of disagreements, their occasional misunderstandings. But through it all, their love for each other remained unwavering. There were times when she wondered if he ever regretted taking on the role of father, if he ever wished he had a child of his own. But she never dared to ask. She knew, deep down, that he loved her as much as any biological father could, maybe even more. His love was the choice he made every day, the choice to be present, to be supportive, to be her dad. And that was more than enough. It was everything. It happened on a Tuesday night. Sarah was curled up on the couch with a book, the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm light over the pages. Outside, the city was alive with its usual evening sounds, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of a bus, the muffled chatter of people walking by. Suddenly, the hallway plunged into darkness. The light bulb had finally given out, leaving a gaping void in the small space between her living room and bedroom. It wasn't a huge deal, she knew. Just a light bulb. But in that moment, it felt like more than that. The darkness seemed to amplify the silence of the apartment, highlighting her solitude. A shiver ran down her spine. She told herself not to be ridiculous. She was a grown woman, perfectly capable of changing a light bulb. She had a step stool in the closet, a pack of new bulbs in the pantry. She could handle this. But for some reason, she couldn't bring herself to move. The darkness felt heavy, oppressive. It reminded her of being a little girl, afraid of the monsters under her bed. She closed her book, a feeling of unease settling in her stomach. She stood up, intending to find the step stool, but her feet felt like lead. It was then that she realized she didn't want to do this alone. She wanted the familiar comfort of someone she trusted, someone who could chase away the darkness and make her feel safe again. Someone who always made her feel like everything would be okay. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her phone. It felt silly, calling someone for something so trivial. But the thought of navigating the darkness alone, of fumbling with the step stool and the light bulb, was suddenly unbearable. She scrolled through her contacts, her thumb hovering over a few names, her best friend, her mother, a few casual acquaintances. But none of them felt right. She needed someone who could make her feel safe, someone who wouldn't judge her for being afraid of the dark. Finally, she found the name she was looking for, Dad. A wave of warmth washed over her as she tapped the icon. It was a silly nickname, but it's what she knew him as and what she always would know him as. The phone rang twice before he answered. Sarah? Everything okay? His voice was immediately filled with concern, the way it always was when she called late at night. Hey, Dad, she said, trying to sound casual, as though she had just remembered something she wanted to ask him. Sorry to bother you, but my hallway light just went out and I can't seem to find a replacement. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. A light bulb? That's it? Yeah, she said, feeling a little foolish. I know it's silly, but I'm kind of creeped out by the dark. He chuckled softly. Don't worry about it. I'll be right over. You don't have to, Dad, she protested, even though a part of her was desperately relieved. It's late. I can handle it in the morning. Nonsense, he said. I'm already up. Besides, what kind of dad would I be if I let my little girl stay in the dark? His words brought a lump to her throat. Thanks, Dad, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I really appreciate it. Anytime, sweetheart, he said. I'll be there in about 20 minutes. True to his word, David arrived 20 minutes later, a small toolbox in hand and a reassuring smile on his face. He was wearing his usual uniform, a worn-out flannel shirt, jeans, and his trusty work boots. His hair, once a vibrant blonde, was now streaked with gray, but his blue eyes still sparkled with warmth and kindness. At 64, David wasn't as spry as he used to be, but he was still a strong, capable man. Years of working with his hands had given him a solid build, and his movements, while a little slower, were still deliberate and purposeful. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, the kind that comes from a lifetime of hard work and dedication. His hands were calloused, and she knew he had earned every one of those lines. Sorry to drag you out so late, Dad, Sarah said, as she led him into the apartment. Nonsense, he replied, patting her on the shoulder. I was just catching up on the news. Besides, a damsel in distress needs her knight in shining armor, right? Sarah chuckled, feeling her anxiety melt away in his presence. I wouldn't exactly call myself a damsel in distress, she said, but I appreciate the sentiment. He set the toolbox down on the floor and surveyed the scene. All right, let's get this show on the road, he said, rubbing his hands together. Where's the light bulb? Sarah pointed to the pantry, and he retrieved a new bulb, whistling softly as he walked back to the hallway. He was always whistling, she remembered. Her mother would always comment on it, saying how he always whistled when he was happy. It was a comforting habit, a sign that everything was all right. He looked up at the dark socket, his brow furrowed in concentration. Looks like we're going to need a chair, he said. Think you can find one for me? Sarah retrieved a kitchen chair, a simple wooden one with a slightly wobbly leg. This is probably the sturdiest one I have, she said, handing it to him. David examined the chair with a critical eye. Might be a little shaky, he said. You'll have to hold it steady for me. He carefully positioned the chair under the light fixture, testing its stability before climbing on. Sarah stood behind him, her hands resting lightly on the back of the chair, ready to provide support. The air was thick with a strange mix of familiarity and anticipation. The mundane task of changing a light bulb, the comforting presence of her father figure, the close proximity in the small hallway, it all created a sense of intimacy that Sarah hadn't noticed before. David reached up, his fingers brushing against the cool glass of the burnt-out bulb. He twisted it gently, but it wouldn't budge. "This thing's really stuck," he grunted, straining slightly. Sarah tightened her grip on the chair, her knuckles turning white. "Be careful, Dad," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He tried again, applying more pressure. The bulb finally gave way with a soft pop, and he carefully unscrewed it, holding it in his hand like a precious artifact. "There we go," he said, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. "One down, one to go." He reached for the new light bulb, his movements slow and deliberate. As he extended his arm, his flannel shirt rode up slightly, exposing a sliver of skin above his jeans. It was nothing scandalous, just a glimpse of his lower back. But for some reason, Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away. It wasn't a sexual thing, not exactly. It was more like a sudden, overwhelming awareness of him as a man, as a physical being. She had always seen him as Dad, a comforting, reliable presence. But in that moment, she saw the strength in his arms, the curve of his back, the way his muscles tensed as he reached. She saw the years etched on his face, the lines that spoke of hard work and a life well lived. A strange wave of emotion washed over her, a mix of affection, gratitude, and something else she couldn't quite name. It was unsettling, confusing. She had never thought of him in this way before. He inserted the new light bulb into the socket and twisted it until it clicked into place. A warm, golden light filled the hallway, chasing away the shadows. "There we go," he said, stepping down from the chair. "Good as new." He turned to face her, a smile on his face. "See? That wasn't so bad, was it?" Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest. She wanted to say something, to acknowledge the strange shift in the atmosphere, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she just nodded, forcing a weak smile. "Thanks, Dad," she said, her voice sounding strained even to her own ears. He seemed to notice something was off. His smile faltered slightly, and he tilted his head, studying her with a concerned expression. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice soft and gentle. "You seem a little flushed." She swallowed hard, trying to regain her composure. "Yeah, I'm fine," she said, avoiding his gaze. "Just a little tired, I guess." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue. "All right," he said. "But if you need anything else, don't hesitate to call." He started to gather his tools, his movements slow and deliberate. Sarah watched him, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't keep this new awareness bottled up inside forever. Something had shifted between them, something that couldn't be ignored. But what was she going to do about it? He picked up his toolbox and started towards the door. Sarah stood frozen, her mind still reeling. She knew she should say something, anything, to break the tension. But the words wouldn't come. As he reached the doorway, she acted on impulse. It was a sudden, almost involuntary movement, like a reflex she couldn't control. Her hand left the back of the chair and reached out, her fingers brushing against the small of his back. It was a light touch, barely there. But it was enough to break the spell. David stopped in his tracks, his body tensing slightly. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. What was she doing? This was crazy. This was wrong. But she couldn't pull back. The touch felt electric, sending a jolt of energy through her body. She wanted to feel more, to explore this new sensation, to understand what was happening to her. Her fingers curled slightly, pressing into his back. She could feel the warmth of his skin through his shirt, the subtle flex of his muscles. It was intoxicating. She slid her hand around his waist, her fingers meeting on the other side. She was holding him now, embracing him from behind. It was a bold, audacious move, completely out of character. The silence in the apartment was deafening. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, the frantic rhythm echoing the turmoil in her mind. She closed her eyes, savoring the moment, allowing herself to feel the forbidden pleasure of his touch. This was wrong, she knew. But it felt so right. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, David turned around. His face was a mask of confusion and surprise. His blue eyes, usually so warm and comforting, were now filled with a mixture of shock and something else she couldn't quite decipher. He looked down at her hand, still wrapped around his waist. And in that moment, she knew that everything had changed. The light from the hallway illuminated his face, highlighting the lines around his eyes, the slight furrow in his brow. He looked older in that moment, more vulnerable. The easygoing smile he usually wore was gone, replaced by a look of profound confusion and something else. Was it hurt? Disappointment? She couldn't tell. His gaze flickered down to her hand, still firmly planted on his waist. He didn't pull away, didn't flinch. He just stared at her hand, as if trying to understand how it had gotten there. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Sarah knew she had to say something, to explain her actions, to apologize for crossing the line. But the words wouldn't come. She was too afraid of what she might reveal, too afraid of shattering the fragile bond they had shared for so many years. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. It was the way he said her name, the tone laced with concern and a hint of something else, that made her heart ache. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. She wanted to tell him how she felt, to explain the confusing mix of emotions that had overwhelmed her. But she couldn't. She was too afraid of losing him, of destroying everything they had built together. She started, her voice trembling. "I don't know what came over me." He continued to look at her, his expression unreadable. She could see the questions swirling in his eyes, the unspoken words hanging in the air between them. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "I didn't mean to." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. She didn't know what she had meant to do. All she knew was that she had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The hallway was not as brightly lit as she previously thought. Now, she felt that it was darker than ever before. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, his eyes searching hers, trying to understand the unspoken words that hung in the air. Sarah felt a tear slide down her cheek. She knew she had hurt him, had confused him. She had jeopardized everything they had. Finally, he reached up and gently took her hand from his waist. His touch was light, almost hesitant. It wasn't the firm, reassuring grip she was used to. He held her hand in his for a moment, his fingers tracing the lines on her palm. Then he slowly released it. "I should go," he said, his voice barely audible. Sarah's heart sank. She wanted to beg him to stay, to talk things out, to forgive her. But she knew it was no use. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. She watched him walk towards the door, his shoulders slumped, his steps heavy. He didn't turn around, didn't say goodbye. As the door clicked shut behind him, Sarah felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had lost him. She had destroyed the most important relationship in her life. She sank to the floor, burying her face in her hands. The hallway light, now shining brightly, seemed to mock her with its cheerful glow. What was she going to do now? How could she face him again? How could she ever explain what had happened? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswered and unanswerable. All she knew was that her life had changed forever, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. The silence of the apartment was complete, broken only by her sobs. He was gone, and she was alone in the brightly lit hallway, the darkness now inside of her. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah didn't hear from David. She tried calling him a few times, but he didn't answer. She even drove by his house once, but she couldn't bring herself to knock on the door. The silence was deafening. It filled every corner of her apartment, a constant reminder of her mistake. She replayed the scene in her head over and over again, wondering what she could have done differently. Had she ruined everything? Was their relationship beyond repair? She missed him terribly. She missed his phone calls, his visits, his comforting presence. She missed his advice, his support, his unwavering love. She knew she had to do something. She couldn't let their relationship fade away without a fight. But what could she do? How could she possibly explain her actions? How could she make him understand? She decided to write him a letter. She poured her heart out on paper, explaining her confusion, her fears, her regrets. She told him how much she valued their relationship, how much she needed him in her life. She sealed the letter and drove to his house, slipping it into his mailbox. Then she waited. Days turned into weeks again, and still no word from David. Sarah started to lose hope. Maybe she had ruined everything after all. Then, one evening, as she was getting ready for bed, her phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID, her heart leaping into her throat. It was David. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers trembling as she reached for the phone. What was she going to say? What was he going to say? She took a deep breath and answered the call. "Hello," she said, her voice barely a whisper. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, finally, he spoke. "Sarah," he said, his voice sounding tired but gentle. "Can we talk? The story will continue, but what will they say? Will they ever be the same again? Will Sarah be able to live with the consequences of her actions? Or will this be the end of their unique bond? Only time will tell."